Okay, everyone, welcome to Practical Management or Practical Magic. Sexual harassment is happening in your library. What should you do about it? Hosted by the LAMA Practical and Applied Management Committee. This is the next discussion in our supervisory conversation series in which we strive to offer a synchronous forum for all interested participants, regardless of your membership status in ALA or your position in a library. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the LAMA PAM YouTube channel. And I'll share a link to that in the chat window. Today's featured presenters are Candice Benjes-Small and Jennifer Knievel. Jennifer Resor-Whicker participated in the planning of this session but was unable to attend today. Candice Benjes-Small is the head of research at William & Mary University Libraries. She's co-chair of the Virginia chapter of ACRL. Jennifer Knievel is the director of arts and humanities and an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder Libraries. She has held a variety of management roles since 2009. And Candice and Jennifer, I will hand things over to you.
But not really.
Oh. There we go.
Okay. All right. Shall we start, Jennifer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So we're going to start with a poll. And we're going to ask you participants to just reflect from like a gut reaction whether each scenario is sexual harassment. We'll do this poll at the beginning, and then we're going to loop back to it after we talk about our study. This kind of get you thinking about this very important topic. So here's our first scenario. A student worker told her supervisor that another staff member from the same department asked her on a date and then demonstrated displeasure when she declined but did not ask again. So think about whether you consider that sexual harassment. And scenario 2, we'll show you 3 and then we'll run the poll. That's right, Jennifer, right?
Yeah.
Molly has noticed that whenever she wears a skirt, George seems to stare at her legs a lot. It makes her uncomfortable. Molly is a peer to George's boss. And then the third one is Pat, a library patron, asks Terry, a librarian, out for a drink. Terry accepts. So we'll now invite you to say, and we know these are complicated, so this is total just, if you had to say one or the other, yes or no, which one would you say?
Okay, it looks like we have participation from most people, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and then we're going to come back to this in a little while.
Okay. We need to get rid of the poll, Jennifer.
Oh, sorry. Is it gone?
Nope.
Oh, no.
Okay, I had to close it on my screen, so viewers, if you are still seeing it, you may also have to minimize it on your screen. Some things don't seem to be totally within our control. So to return to our presentation, we first are going to talk about why did we even start asking about sexual harassment in academic libraries, and how do we go about asking about it. To give you just some personal examples, my personal example goes back to when I was in a job about 20 years ago, and there was an older man in my department. We both worked at the reference desk, and I noticed that whenever I wore a skirt, that he would kind of stare at my legs a lot, and it made me a little uncomfortable. Even more alarming to me, I heard that there were female students who refused to come to the desk when he was there because the way he looked at them made them uncomfortable. But this was all through hearsay. I never actually had a student say to me they were uncomfortable. I heard from other librarians. I also heard from other librarians that they were uncomfortable, but no one else felt comfortable going to the library director to say anything. And when I finally did, I was told, oh, well, that's just so-and-so. He's really, he's just an old guy. He can't hurt you. Don't worry about it. And that story really stuck with me. Jennifer, what's your story?
One of the stories that really stuck with me was early in my career. When I was on the reference desk, there was a patron who would come in and he would sort of hang around the reference room. And he would stick around there for a while and he would wait for me to come on shift. And then once I got to the desk, he would come to the desk and he would ask a lot of questions. He'd ask me questions about whether or not I had a boyfriend and what I was doing after work and what time I was going to be done with work. And then he would wait for me outside. And at the time, I didn't think of this as shocking as I think of it now. At the time, everyone would just sort of shrug and be like, yeah, some patrons do that. And I had to figure out on my own how to get him to leave me alone.
And the more that we talk to our colleagues, the more we hear similar stories. And in 2017, when the Me Too movement was really coming around, I posted on Facebook. And I just put a general call out to my Facebook friends with apparently a typo I see now, asking if anyone else would be interested in doing a survey to assess sexual harassment in libraries, because we had a lot of anecdotal information and a lot of people talked about their personal experiences, but there were no statistics looking at the profession on a wider level, what was going on. So I put out that call, and Jennifer Resor-Whicker from Radford University and Jennifer Knievel from UC Boulder, two librarians who responded right away and said they were interested. And then we also had the fortune to have Allison Weisskopf and Joanna Hunter, who are two sociology professors at Radford University, said they were very interested in working on such a research project with us. So one of the big kind of things to talk about when you're talking about sexual harassment is what is the definition of it. And a lot of people fall into the legal definition, the EEOC definition. And I think a lot of us talk about sexual harassment as that kind of quid pro quo. If you don't do this, you will get fired or be harmed professionally if you don't do something. But even the legal definition has a lot more detail to it. And a few things that jumped out at us as librarians was that it doesn't have to be of a sexual nature. It can include offensive remarks about a person's sex. So that's one line that we underlined. And then also the one that we've never heard libraries really talk about is down at the bottom. It says the harasser can be the victim's supervisor, which is, I think, the classic sexual harassment scenario, but also a supervisor in another area, a coworker, or someone who is not an employee of the employer, such as a client or customer. And those are the lines that really stood out to us when it comes to especially people who are in public services or deal with vendors in libraries. In addition to the legal definition, the literature on sexual harassment often talks about a psychological construct. And what the psychological construct does is it thinks about unwanted, unwelcome, sex-related behaviors at work, not having to reach that legalistic level of frequency or severity. Rather, it recognizes that workers who experience these behaviors at any rate or severity are negatively affected by them. As a result, the sexual harassment literature does not require victims to note a pattern of actions in order to qualify the behaviors as sexual harassment. Instead, the researchers tend to look at a sexual harassment in a more nuanced way and often across the spectrum in terms of severity.
So in our interest in measuring this in a quantitative way for the first time among libraries, we did some research into how do people measure sexual harassment in the workplace. And we found that the most common tool that is used is called the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire. It was developed by Fitzgerald and colleagues in 1995, and it's been administered in a lot of different fields and across a lot of different areas, but it had not been distributed specifically in libraries before. What this tool does is ask a lot of questions about people's specific experiences and whether or not they've had an experience that falls into any of the different categories of what might be described as sexual harassment. So we decided this was the best tool to use to measure the frequency of sexual harassment in libraries. And we worked with the sociologists to make sure that we were administering it in a way that was going to be robust. What this tool asks for when you send the survey is a person's experiences in the most recent 5 years. So it doesn't go back to one's entire lifetime or career, but only recent history. These are what some of the questions look like. So the survey itself is 30 items that assesses individual experiences with the 5 dimensions of sexual harassment. So it asks about gender harassment, seductive behavior, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about exactly what we mean by all those things. Gender harassment, seductive behavior, sexual bribery, sexual coercion, and sexual assault. In the sexual assault category, it's important to understand that in the sociology literature that includes unwelcome touch. So these questions asked about all these experiences without using the word sexual harassment, because the phrase sexual harassment is such a loaded phrase, and many people think that it means something very specific instead of meaning something fairly general. What we did with this survey was we distributed it through multiple different ALA listservs, and we invited people to fill it out if they worked in an academic library, regardless of their role in the library. And we did not collect information about what someone's position was. So we don't necessarily have information about whether or not these experiences are from librarians or from staff or from students. We just know that we asked everyone to fill it out if they worked in an academic library, and regardless of whether they had experienced these behaviors or not. We got over 600 responses in the time that this survey was open. And one of the things that really took us by surprise was how many people filled out the survey and then reached out to us in email when they were done. People really wanted to share their stories with us. One of the things you'll see at the top of this screen is we're asking, have you ever been in a situation or experience like this with a coworker or a patron? If a respondent clicked yes, then we asked them whether it was a coworker or a patron that they had that experience with. One of the things that we were really sensitive to is that this is a hard topic to discuss, and we did not want to risk re-traumatizing anyone. We got IRB approval for this survey from all 3 of our institutions that were involved, and we made sure to provide at the end of the survey links to resources like RAIN to help anybody who needed support after filling out the survey. Okay. Is that volume a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay. So like we said, the definitions really matter, but it's important to be able to be clear about what it is we're talking about. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about what those categories mean.
We'll be looking at the 3 categories that scored highest among those who worked in academic libraries. First is gender harassment, and that includes generalized sexist remarks and behaviors, things like women can't make good leaders or women are so emotional. This was measured by 7 questions, and this was experienced by 78.1% of all respondents. 39.3% experienced it from a coworker, and 31.2% experienced it by a patron, and 29.4% reported that they had had both patrons and coworkers do this to them.
So the next most common category was seductive behavior. And this encompasses inappropriate, offensive, but essentially sanction-free advances. Some examples are repeated requests for dates, making comments about one's appearance or attractiveness in ways that are unwelcome. These behaviors were experienced by 64.4% of our respondents. And you'll see that a higher proportion of these came from patrons. We had 33.5% by coworkers and 48.6%, so almost half, by patrons, and 17.9% from both. Sanction-free, meaning that there's no consequence to the harasser.
The third category that had the highest percentage of people who said they had had that experience was sexual assault, which is horrifying enough, but then it's such a strong phrase we all kind of reacted to, oh my gosh, what's going on there? It is important to note the questionnaire considers any unwelcome physical touch to be sexual assault, even a benign location such as the hand or the elbow. So it's not, it's a terrible thing, of course, but it includes any kind of touch. And 35.2% of participants said that they had experienced sexual assault. So of that 35%, almost half had been touched in an unwelcome way by a coworker, 37% by a patron, and then 15.6% had it from both.
Sorry about that. We're not sure why we keep losing our screen there. We'll try to grab it back.
And then Jennifer is going to talk about the last category, or last question.
So the other categories that were included in the survey were the sexual coercion categories, and those we had very small amounts of reported incidents of that, which is a good thing, because those are the worst categories, and that's pretty normal for how the research looks across industries for how common that is. So I mentioned earlier that the survey itself does not use the phrase sexual harassment until the very end. So the respondents were asked all those questions about what experiences they had had. And then at the very end, the last question that they're asked is if they've ever been sexually harassed. This is the final question. So theoretically, anyone who said yes to any of the things on the survey should say yes to this question, because that is what the survey is measuring. So the numbers should be the same of people who answered yes to this and people who answered yes to at least one item on the survey. And what we found was that 83% of our respondents said no to this question. And that was despite the fact that almost 78% said yes to one of the questions on the survey. These numbers should match, but they don't. And that tells us a handful of things. One of them is that people have an unnecessarily narrow mental definition of what sexual harassment really is. Many people think that it needs to be much more severe in order to qualify as sexual harassment than it actually does. And one of the other things that this tells us is that we work in an industry where sexual harassment is just an expected part of the job, and that librarians simply assume, sort of like Candice's experience that she talked about at the beginning of hearing, well, that man, he's just harmless. You just have to work with that anyway. But many people assume that in order to do the job, you have to put up with sexual harassment at work.
And Jennifer, this might be a good time to also mention that in our literature review, we found that to be really common among other female-dominated professions. There's been some recent work in the nursing field and in the social work field where workers had similar kinds of experiences on the job, and they said, well, that's just what happens when you work with patients. Mm-hmm. And so it's that acceptance of it, and then a growing toleration, which then creates a vicious cycle, so that when new people enter the profession, they're told, well, that's just how it is. Right. So we're going to go back to our poll, and is it sexual harassment? So our first one was about the student worker telling the supervisor that another staff member from the same department asked her on a date and demonstrated displeasure when she declined but did not ask again. So Jennifer, are you able to pull up the poll from before?
Okay, can everybody see those results?
I can, so hopefully everyone else can. If you can't, it says that 25% said yes, it is harassment, and 75% said no, it is not. So what do you think, Jennifer?
So I think this doesn't meet the legal definition of harassment because it's not a pattern. But if you look at the psychological construct, there is damage to this behavior. This question actually came from a real life experience of a student that I know. And her response to this experience was when that staff member was present, she was very worried about how he would treat her after that day, and she would hide. She would try to guess when he was going to be around and try to be somewhere else. So the damage was really meaningful to her, even though there wasn't a pattern.
All right, and our next one, Molly has noticed that whenever she wears a skirt, George seems to stare at her legs a lot. It makes her uncomfortable. Molly's appeal to George's boss is it harassment? So 5% said no, and 79% said yes.
What do you think, Candice?
This one I would say yes to, and falls more into the legal. We included it because sometimes there's the misconception that there has to be a power differential and the power has to be in the hands of the supervisor. And here is a case where the supervisor level is higher than the person who's doing the harassment, but it still would be considered to be sexual harassment. And this codes back to my example in that I had told the director that I was uncomfortable and he kind of blew it off. And then a new director came in and I was promoted. And when I was promoted to be above my former colleague, I first told him this makes me uncomfortable. And first he apologized. And then he paused and he said, but if women don't want me to look, they shouldn't wear dresses. And I said, and now we're documenting. And I don't know if I still would have had the courage to take that step if I hadn't been promoted. And I knew that he was no longer in my department in the office next door to me at the same level as me. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic there where the classic sexual harassment is where you have power, where the harasser has power over the harassed, and yet I only felt comfortable really following through with all the steps when I felt like I had more control over the situation.
And our third one, Pat, a library patron, asks Terry, a librarian, out for a drink, and Terry accepts. And 2% of you said yes, and 8% of you said yes, and 92% of you said no. Candice, what's your initial thought on this one?
Yeah, I think as long as we're assuming that Terry wanted to accept, then this is an example of something that would not be considered sexual harassment. What do you think, Jennifer?
I agree. I think because we're assuming from the way we phrased this question that this was welcome attention, and the fact that it's welcome changes the calculus substantially.
There's a lot of conversation going on in the Me Too discussion realm, where some people are saying, so you mean that I can never talk to a colleague, I can never ask them out, I can never have a relationship that goes beyond professional with someone I work with? And all we have to do on campus is look around, and we all know people who are married or partnered with someone else, either in the library or on campus or in a workplace situation. And so we also wanted to include this because this is part of that Me Too conversation going on, that sexual harassment doesn't mean all comments are verboten.
And I think going back to example number one, part of what made that interaction so problematic was the response when the person asked a student for a date and was declined. Mm-hmm. So, asking a student who reports in your department is inherently problematic, But added on to that, the sort of expression of anger when she said no was what really made that a painful experience for her. If, you know, she might have had a very different experience if the man who asked her had been a little bit more positive or understanding when she declined him.
So much of this does go back into power, doesn't it, Jennifer?
Always.
About having power or feeling like you're powerless or feeling like you're trapped. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I have to close down the poll myself. So viewers, you may also need to minimize it. Here's a screenshot of the sexual harassment software that is used at William & Mary. Haven, I think, is one of the most popular one used to do Title IX and Clery Act training, and we're required to take it every year. And it's really well done. I really do think this is a well done product. But the focus is more on what to do if a student discloses a sexual assault or stalking to us, or what to do if you suspect a coworker is being abused or if a supervisor is being sexually aggressive. So those are like clear cut, something is really wrong. What are the procedures to follow? They don't really help you with figuring out those things that are not so clear cut. And I think that is an issue. And especially for our student workers who work at the desk, we spend a lot of time teaching them how to use the equipment to check books out or how to use databases. But at least historically, from what I've seen, very few desks spend a lot of time talking about how to handle uncomfortable interactions with patrons and what to do if something happens that makes them uncomfortable.
There's so much need on campuses for this kind of training that's talking about helping faculty and staff respond when a student discloses a sexual assault to them or other kinds of stalking. But one of the things that we see in our data is that a really large percentage of the harassment people are experiencing is below that threshold. And that's a very good thing, but it means that we also need to pay attention to that threshold because the evidence is really strong that the negative influences on individuals and on the rest of their workplace are really pervasive when sexual harassment is permitted.
It goes back to that idea of the hostile environment, doesn't it, Jennifer?
It does, and I think that one of the things that we read over and over again was that in places where harassment is permitted, there's a lot of absenteeism, there's a lot of turnover, that even the people who are not the targets still suffer. And so this is this is a problem that affects everyone in the environment, even if it's not happening to everyone.
And Jennifer, I believe our research also showed that if someone experienced gender harassment, they were much more likely to experience other forms of harassment too. So it does seem to be like an environment where one happens, then other very problematic behaviors also happen.
Exactly, they're really correlated with happening together. And one of the things that we read in our research for this is that there are certain environments that make harassment more likely because they have certain characteristics. So for example, environments where clients or customers, or in our case, patrons, feel like they have a power relationship over the librarian, they're much more likely to be harassing there. A lot of research shows that female-dominated professions don't have as much harassment, but then that changes if those female-dominated professions are working with clients or customers. So like Candice was saying earlier, nursing and social work have really high incidents of sexual harassment, and that's because of whom they're interacting with.
Yeah, and also all three professions are trained that we need to have an almost counseling role where we have to be friendly and approachable and open, and we want people to come to us. And so that is a behavior that can be misinterpreted and open our profession up to these kinds of behaviors. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shift a little bit into what kind of training that your institutions are doing and what are some of the best practices that Jennifer and I recommend. So we have this poll, right? We're going to do a poll, Jennifer?
Yes.
Yes. So we're going to ask you about harassment training at your institution. And so you can choose all that apply. Does it cover quid pro quo sexual coercion, which is if you do this, then this will happen? Does it cover pattern of harassment by colleagues, hostile environment, harassment from patrons, none of the above, or not sure? Because it could be that you had your training when you started, and that was a while ago. Looks like the polling has slowed down.
Okay.
We can see that about 60% say the training covers quid pro quo, about 54% pattern of harassment, 50% hostile environment created by colleagues, and the numbers drop down to 23% for harassment from patrons. Then 19% say none of the above, and 23% said not sure. So I think that aligns pretty well with what we are hearing from the field and what Jennifer and I have seen from our institutions.
Yeah, I think they're much more likely to cover the things that are really, really easy to identify and define, because they're so much more straightforward, but it makes it a lot harder when you start talking about some of the more difficult to define. And in particular for academic libraries, I think because not most of the campus community doesn't necessarily deal with people who are not members of the community, that it's not very prominent in policies to talk about patrons.
Move on to the next poll, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So maybe I have to close this poll. Okay. So in this poll, we're asking you if a librarian reports that a patron was leering, staring, and generally making her uncomfortable during her desk shift, what would happen at your library?
Looks like that slowed down, so I'll post the results here.
So it's almost like half. So I wonder if it's the same half, right? We can't tell if it's the same person, but I wonder if there are institutions that have policies and then there are others and plans and those that don't. I don't know. But I note that the suggesting strategies to deter the behavior, once again putting the onus or the power back in the librarian. It's kind of two sides of the same coin where you're making her responsible for it, but also trying to give her some ways to avoid it.
And I'm curious about the library official asking the patron to stop, whether people are imagining that as the librarian that's having that experience or someone else from the library who would be asking that patron to stop, and how that might be handled. For example, like I know some libraries have on-site security, and maybe the security guards would be someone who would approach the patron. And I think, I see that half of the respondents have an existing policy, and that's always really helpful.
I'm going to close the poll again. And this is our last poll, right, Jennifer?
Yes. Okay.
And this asks, does your institution have a sexual harassment policy that explicitly covers patron harassment? Yes, no, only about coworkers. No, we don't have any harassment policy I'm aware of, and I'm not sure. People are kind of bopping around. I think we're pretty much done.
So most of the respondents, their existing policy is only explicit about coworker harassment. I'm very pleased to see 24% of you have a policy in place that covers patrons. I think that 21% of, I'm not sure, either whether we have a policy or whether it covers patron harassment is pretty common, that sometimes it's not at all clear whether existing policies apply to patrons or not.
Mm-hmm. Be interested to see those policies for the 7 who have them, wouldn't it, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would. I would really like to see those.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to email them to us. All right. I'm going to close the poll. And back to you, Jennifer.
Okay. So, do we really need policies for this? The answer is yes, we really do need policies to manage this behavior. I was watching the chat going by a little bit during that last poll, and I saw lots of people commenting that they had to use policies that were really intended to control something else in order to manage this behavior. But it is such damaging behavior that it is important that a policy explicitly covers this so that we're not waiting for some coincident behavior in order to try to control it. A policy also needs a procedure. So knowing that this behavior isn't permitted is one step, but knowing what to do when it happens is just as important to the people who are experiencing it. And one of the things in the poll earlier, we have lots of people who weren't sure whether their policy covered it or not. I'm actually, until recently, I was not sure whether or not our policy covered this either, because I trained here 20 years ago. And that's the last time that I saw the policy. And I assumed that it was different now. And it turns out that it is. But I didn't actually know. And so one of the important elements here is routine training to make sure that people are clear on what is and isn't covered, but also to remind people that this doesn't have to be the way that our workplaces are, that we don't necessarily have to be in a harassing environment in order to be librarians. And one other comment that came through the chat that I wanted to talk about is not all harassment is male on female, and that's absolutely true. One of the things that our study showed and that most other studies showed is that the vast, vast majority of targets of harassment are women, but it's not only women. And that is consistently the case across all the studies, that men can be targets of harassment too, either from women or from other men. And in particular, men are likely to experience gender harassment. The first category, like sort of comments about your gender that are not necessarily sexual in nature. And so we need policies in place to protect all of us, protect everyone from these behaviors, not just the women, but the men as well.
And even if you're not in a position where you could create policy, Jennifer and I tried to think about some best practices that you might be able to do as someone who is a frontline person, or maybe has a little bit of power, but just not up to the level of creating policy. And also policy can take a while. And so as Jennifer said, the first one is really training. Maybe you can have HR come in, or Office of Diversity. Often we'll have some, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ types of harassment, that can be a really good resource for you on an academic campus. And it's really important to recognize harassment that is present. And also, it's an important statement that the toleration of harassment is not acceptable, and that it is not an expectation of the job. Oh, that's just so-and-so, that's just what happens.
But bystander training can be a really effective way to help people cope with harassment at work, especially if you're in an environment where getting a policy on the books isn't realistic. And that can really help people who observe harassment so that they can be more effective to step in. Sometimes it's really hard to ask the target of harassment to solve her own harassment and to change that situation for herself or for himself. And what can be really helpful is to have coworkers who know how to step in and who have been trained in how to step in, because there are a lot of opportunities for bystander intervention that aren't necessarily kind of shouldering your way into the situation and saying, hey, stop it. But there are a lot of other ways to intervene that can be just as effective, that you can help people know about by providing bystander training.
And the bystander training can help you as an observer so that you're not frozen in the moment, right? We all know an hour later what we should have done, but the bystander training is to kind of prep you with scripts so that in the moment you can launch into motion at the time. But the planning ahead is important because you want your coworker who is being harassed to have power in the situation too. And I was at a session at the Virginia Library Association conference recently, and their topic was sexual harassment, and it was mostly public librarians in that setting. And they talked about how as a department, they talked about what should happen if such and such were to happen. So if this patron comes up when Jennifer is at the desk and Jennifer says, I really don't want to talk to that patron anymore. If you see her approach the desk, please call, and then I will let you know if I need you to come over and help me. So coming up with strategies ahead of time with your coworkers, in addition to formal training, is one way to help each other.
So one thing that's particularly important for this group, for LAMA presentation, where we presumably have a lot of managers in our audience, is the importance of believing people who express these experiences. Candice told a story about her boss saying, oh, it's just not a big deal. I had that experience of having a patron who was doing some pretty scary stuff. Like in hindsight, I find that really scary. And even though I told other people about it, no one said, actually we need to intervene and get that behavior to stop. And I think there are a lot of experiences of people just sort of making it seem like not a big deal and saying, well, this is just normal and this is how you have to put up with it. But the most important thing that you can do is believe when it's happening and point it out to each other.
And along with that, we need to remove the shame from it. If you are a victim of sexual harassment, it's not your fault. And that kind of view of you must have done something to invite that behavior means that we become silent about it, and then we don't talk about it, and everyone becomes more isolated, which just leads to more harassment in an environment where it can flourish if it's not brought up and there are consequences for those types of actions. I'll also add, our study was for academic libraries, and we looked specifically at coworkers and patrons, but through conversations presenting our findings. We also know that there are issues with, even in academia, if you are collaborating with a professor outside of them in a patron format, if you're on a committee with them or such, people have said that has been an issue. There have been issues discussed with vendors. And then another area that could be very touchy depending on your campus is donors. What if you have a donor who is sexually harassing the staff or the students? All those should be considered when a library is looking at their policies. So now we will open it up to questions, but here's all our contact information if there is anything you do want to reach out to us later about or want to share policies with us.
Yeah, if you were one of those people that has a policy, we would really like to see it. So please do send that along to us.
I definitely saw people sharing some of their experiences in the chat. Ginger, and were there any questions that you noted that we should answer?
So I've unmuted Lois in case there were some that she noticed as they came along. I've really just been following along with these comments and seeing a lot of things that sound familiar to me as well.
Yeah, a lot of calls for a way to share good policies.
I mean, in my dream world, what I would love to see is for ALA to offer sample or model policies the way that they do for a lot of other kinds of policies that we could adopt. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
There were a couple of questions from the chat window. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The first one was from Jessica. Is there a good library service industry sexual harassment training available? And that may be one that you've talked about already with the Haven software, but
that's what's most commonly used to address Title IX and Clery Act training on campuses, but it is not library specific. I do not know of any library specific training. Jennifer, do you?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I haven't heard of one.
Does anyone else know of one? If so, please share it in the chat because I'm sure others would be interested too.
We have a couple of public librarians in the chat, I've noticed, and I think it's we intend to re-administer this survey in public libraries in a future research project, and everything that we've heard so far, the anecdotal evidence suggests that the numbers will be even higher in that environment. And so I think it's especially important to have policies and procedures in place in those environments where they're so they're environments that tend to make it easier for harassers to harass.
Another question is, I need clarification. Is a pattern required? Example, one of the first three scenarios for it to be sexual harassment.
Some of it depends on your definition of sexual harassment. We are using the psychological social science definition, which says that if it's unwelcome behaviors and that then negatively impact the person who experiences them. Is that kind of a good definition, Jennifer, would you say?
I think so. I mean, I think part of the question is, what is your goal? If the goal is to try to hold the harasser legally accountable, then you need it to meet a legal standard. If your goal is to make your environment less friendly to harassment, then I would want to use the psychological construct instead, in which case a pattern is not necessarily required. So thinking again about that student who was asked on a date, it was only once, and so if we wanted to hold that person legally accountable for harassing the student, it probably wouldn't qualify, but it really impeded her ability to do her job and to be comfortable at work, and that matters a lot. And so that was what we really wanted to solve in that scenario.
That's a great definition, Jennifer.
Another question, how to handle de-escalation. For example, I tell someone they're making me uncomfortable and they get mad at me for being sensitive and start to get loud. I'm at a public library and this happens often.
I think this is a great example where bystander training could really have a positive effect. If that kind of thing is happening in a public library and you have other staff around who know how and have thought about how, and you've talked as a group about how to intervene in that kind of scenario, that can really, like, the most effective de-escalation can sometimes come from somebody else.
There's another comment from Nayama who says, as an administrator who has evolved to address this issue more head-on with patrons, this makes me realize I need to call it out directly in a patron code of conduct. And then Nara answers that our policy is part of the general university policy that supports that. So having it in the patron code of conduct.
Yeah, so cheers to that administrator for thinking about putting that there. I think that's a really great place to have that kind of that policy available, because that gives you also then something to point to directly when you're trying to intervene on the behalf of your employees.
I would also ask Nara, is there teeth to the policy? Something I saw in the group chat was where people are working at institutions that have policies but no actual procedures of what to do if someone is discriminated against.
Another comment that came through was, I think we should be talking about this in ILS programs, because my worst experience with sexual harassment occurred when I was in graduate school during an interview for a position. I felt like I was making too big a deal out of it. Now I know that I wasn't.
That's such a great example of the importance of helping people to understand what is and isn't sexual harassment. And, you know, going back to that slide of most of the respondents in our survey said they had not experienced sexual harassment when most of them actually had. But there's a lot of tendency among targets to downplay what their experience really was. And being able to identify it in the moment helps to empower people who are having that experience. I'm so sorry to hear that that happened to you, and in an interview, no less. That's even such high stakes. But I agree, talking about it in graduate school would really help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also extend my sympathies to the person who experienced that. There was the most recent article I found about the sexual harassment in social work. They were looking at students who had been placed in internships, and that's where they saw instances of the students saying, well, what do you expect? These are people who are really stressed and they're my clients, and so I just have to kind of move beyond it. So already as students, they were internalizing this acceptance of the behavior.
One person asked, if people send policies, is there somewhere you all will share them with us?
We could do a LibGuide, couldn't we, Jennifer?
We could. That's a great idea.
We could link it to the webinar.
And then maybe if we have a few to start with, we can reach out to ALA and ask them, because I saw lots of people liked that idea. So
yes, that was
get them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's absolutely the kind of thing we can put in the comments on the YouTube recording of this, as a link to that LibGuide.
Do either of you have experience with having to have a conversation with a staff member who has been reported for sexual harassment? What was that like, and what tips do you have for having that conversation?
Yeah, so I've been in a management role for a long time. I've had several of those conversations. They're never any fun, but they're really, really important. We have, at my institution, we have a compliance office who is responsible for managing those instances. So when I hear about something like that happening, my requirement is to report that to the compliance office, and the compliance office does all of the interviewing and assessment, which is helpful because they're sort of better trained to have those kinds of conversations. Usually what it comes back to in the end, though, is that if that person reports to me, I need to talk to, in my case, it's always been him. I need to talk to him about what his behavior how his behavior at work needs to change and how I'm going to hold him accountable for that. So putting things in his annual goals and stuff like that.
The only experience I have had with this is with a student worker, and it was a review of why it was inappropriate and why it needed to stop, and then we did not renew his contract at the end of the semester. So that was an example of how the harassment can come from just about any direction.
It looks like we are almost at time, and I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you so much to Candice and Jennifer for this really valuable, informative presentation today. I love the combination of research and practical ways to apply it. So thank you very much. Everyone, I will put the recording, on our YouTube channel as soon as I can, and look forward to another Llama chat in about a month or so.
Thank you so much, Ginger and Lois.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending.